You are standing in a hole in the ground. Not a dramatic, cinematic hole. Not the kind of hole that looks good in a movie, with clean walls and heroic lighting and men with square jaws looking meaningfully into the middle distance. A real hole. A hole that has been dug by exhausted men using inadequate tools into soil that did not want to be dug, that has been rained on continuously for the better part of 3 weeks, that smells like something between a backed-up sewer and the specific, unmistakable smell of things that were recently alive and are no longer, and that is currently occupied by approximately 40 men who have been in it without meaningful relief for 6 days. The walls are mud, the floor is mud. The wooden duckboards that are supposed to keep your feet above the mud are themselves partially submerged in mud, so that what you're actually standing on is a slightly more structured version of the mud it was designed to keep you out of. The water at the bottom of the trench, below the duckboards, in the space between the boards and the actual earth, is somewhere between ankle and knee depth, depending on where you're standing and whether the pumps that are supposed to manage the drainage are currently functional, which they often aren't because the pumps are also subject to the mud's comprehensive ambition to submerge everything. You are in France or Belgium. The distinction is less meaningful than it sounds because the Western Front in 1916, which is where and when we're placing you, in the grinding middle of the war's most attritional phase, between the Somme and Verdun, in the specific period when both sides had committed to a strategy that can be summarized as keep going until the other side runs out of men, runs through both countries in a line of approximately 700 kilometers of trench that stretches from the North Sea coast to the Swiss border. 700 kilometers of this, 700 kilometers of mud and water and men and wire, and the continuous, specifically shaped terror of a battlefield that was unlike anything that had existed before in the history of human warfare. You are here for one day in the trenches of the Western Front, 1916, with the body you have and the knowledge you have, and none of the years of preparation, physical conditioning, psychological adaptation, and sheer accumulated experience of surviving this environment that the men around you have built up across months or years of service. You're not going to find this easy. Let me explain why, starting from the moment you arrived, which was bad, and working through the day, which is not going to improve in the ways you're hoping. The First World War is one of those historical subjects that everyone knows about, and almost nobody actually understands. The popular picture is correct in its broad outlines. The trenches, the mud, the wire, the men going over the top into machine gun fire. But the popular picture misses almost everything that made the daily reality of the Western Front what it was. It misses the specific, granular, hour-by-hour texture of what it meant to exist in that environment. It misses the smell and the cold and the rats and the specific quality of the boredom that existed alongside, the specific quality of the terror, sometimes simultaneously. It misses the ingenuity and the dark humor and the genuine comradeship that men built inside those conditions, and it misses the ways in which those conditions, sustained long enough, broke things in people that couldn't be fixed. You're about to find out what it misses. Let's start from the beginning of your day, which begins, as all days in the trenches begin, before dawn. Chapter 1. Stand to. The moment every day began with a nobody liked it is 4:47 in the morning. You know this because the man beside you, a corporal from Lancashire with the kind of face that suggests he has found very little about the last 8 months amusing, has just informed you that it's time to stand to, and that you need to be on the fire step with your rifle in the next 30 seconds, or he is going to have personal opinions about your character that he will express at considerable length. Stand to. The morning stand to. Dawn and dusk were the times when an attack was most likely. The low light that made movement harder to spot. The transition between darkness and daylight that offered cover for the preliminary stages of an advance. The response to this tactical reality was the mandatory stand to. Every man on the fire step. Every man at the parapet. Rifles ready. Eyes forward into the gray nothing of no man's land, for the 30 to 60 minutes around dawn, while the light came up, and the morning proved once again that no attack was currently materializing. The fire step is a ledge cut into the forward wall of the trench, the parapet side, the side facing the enemy, that allows the men inside the trench to stand at a height where they can see over the top. The trench itself is dug to approximately head height for a standing man, which means that without the fire step, you're in a hole that you can't see out of, which is protective, but not especially useful for the business of watching for enemy activity. The fire step puts your head and the top of your chest above the parapet when you're standing on it, which is useful for observation and absolutely terrifying for all the obvious reasons. You climb onto the fire step. The wood is slippery. Everything is slippery. This is one of the defining qualities of the trench environment. And you grab the sandbag parapet for stability, which means your hands are now in contact with wet sandbags, which means your hands are wet. Your hands are going to be wet for most of the day. This is simply a feature of the environment and not something that improves with time. You look forward into no man's land. No man's land is not what you expected. You expected something dramatic, cratered wasteland, bodies everywhere, the immediate visible evidence of the war's violence. What you're actually looking at in the gray pre-dawn light is harder to read than that. There is wire, a lot of wire. The concertina wire, and the flat wire, and the picket wire that has been strung in front of the trenches in multiple belts to slow any attacking force. Beyond the wire, ground that is churned and broken with the specific texture of earth that has been subjected to artillery fire repeatedly and has lost its original topography entirely. Shell craters that have filled with water and are now shallow ponds. The remains of what might have been a farm building or a tree line, reduced to abstract shapes by months of bombardment. And in the distance, perhaps 100 meters, perhaps 200, the distance varies significantly along the front. The German parapet, their sandbags, their wire, their fire step, presumably occupied by German soldiers doing exactly what you're doing, standing in the cold gray morning, looking at the British parapet, waiting for the light to come up and prove that no attack is materializing. The morning is cold, not dramatically cold. It's summer or near it, but cold in the specific way of a pre-dawn morning, after a night of rain, when everything is wet, and the warmth that your body generates is being conducted away through your wet clothing faster than you can produce it. You're wearing a wool uniform that is wet. Wool retains some insulating properties when wet, which is the only reason you're not in serious hypothermic trouble. But some insulating properties is doing a lot of work in that sentence. The man beside you, the corporal from Lancashire, is looking forward with the specific flat expression of someone who has done this several hundred times and has reached a relationship with the process that is neither acceptance nor resignation, but something further along the spectrum, something that doesn't have a straightforward civilian name. He is watching no man's land, the way you watch a road you've driven 1,000 times, automatically without active attention, the vigilance running as a background process, while the front of his mind is probably somewhere entirely different. You're watching no man's land, the way you watch a road you've never seen before, in conditions you've never driven in a vehicle you don't entirely know how to operate, while someone is telling you that things might come out of the dark. Your attention is extremely active, and your body is producing adrenaline in quantities that your system was designed for intermittent use rather than sustained deployment. The corporal notices this. He says nothing, because what is there to say? He has seen new men on the fire step before. He knows what the next few hours are going to do to that particular quality of attention, and his knowledge is not optimistic about its long-term sustainability. The light comes up slowly. The gray becomes slightly less gray. The wire becomes slightly more visible. No man's land resolves from a shape into a landscape. A ruined, broken landscape that carries the record of everything that's happened to it since 1914, but a landscape nonetheless, with a specific character that men who have been here long enough know the way they know their own neighborhoods. No attack materializes. This is the most common outcome of stand-to. Most mornings, the light comes up, And no man's land is empty of movement, and the order comes down to stand down, and the men step off the fire step, and the morning routine begins. Stand down. You step off the fire step and discover that your legs, which have been holding you in one position on a wet wooden ledge for 45 minutes, have opinions about this. Nothing dramatic, just the specific low-level complaint of muscles that have been used in a sustained, constrained way and are registering their awareness of the fact. This is, in the context of the day ahead, a very minor physical complaint. You are going to have significantly larger ones before the day is done. The morning routine begins. In the trench, the morning after, stand down means rum ration, breakfast if breakfast is available, and the beginning of the day's work. The rum ration is real and not a detail. Each man was issued a small measure of rum, approximately 1/8 of a pint, typically at stand down in the morning. The rum was not issued for recreational purposes. It was issued because the men were cold and wet and had been standing on a fire step in the pre-dawn for 45 minutes and needed the specific, immediate physiological assistance that a small amount of spirits provided in those conditions. It was warmth in liquid form, distributed as part of the daily logistics of keeping soldiers functional. You drink your rum. It is given everything, exactly as welcome as advertised. It is not enough rum to matter from an impairment perspective. 1/8 of a pint is not a significant amount of alcohol, even for a smaller person. But it is enough rum to produce a brief, specific warmth that moves from your throat to your stomach and radiates outward in a way that is genuinely, immediately helpful. You're going to remember this rum for a disproportionately long time, relative to the amount of it that there was. Breakfast is the next problem. The food situation in the trenches is one of the defining features of trench life, and we'll address it more fully later. But the morning breakfast is a good introduction to the general parameters of the situation. Food was brought up to the front line, trenches from the rear, from the field kitchens that were established in the safer rear areas, where cooking over an open fire was possible without immediately attracting enemy fire. The food that made this journey, typically carried in containers up the communication trenches by carrying parties that moved at night or in low-light conditions to minimize exposure, was hot when it left the kitchen and considerably less hot when it arrived. The distance from the field kitchen to the front-line trench and the route it had to travel through communication trenches that were narrow, muddy, and frequently ankle-deep in water meant that the food could take 2 to 3 hours to make its journey. What arrived at the front line was the ghost of what had left the kitchen. The structural integrity of the meal was intact, but the temperature was somewhere between lukewarm and barely warm at all. You are eating lukewarm stew from a mess tin sitting on the fire step because there's nowhere else to sit, with the mud of the trench walls at your back and the smell of the trench in your nostrils. And the stew is fine, not good, not the kind of thing you'd choose if alternatives existed, but food and calories, and the specific comfort of eating something warm. Adjacent, when warm adjacent, is the best available option. Welcome to the morning routine of the Western Front. Chapter 2. The trench itself. What it actually was and why it was so bad. Before we proceed further into your day, let's establish what you're actually living in, because the trench system of the Western Front was a more complex and more varied environment than the single-word label suggests. The trench system was not a single trench. It was a network, a series of parallel lines running roughly perpendicular to the front, connected by communication trenches running back toward the rear, with the whole system organized in depth so that a breakthrough at the front line didn't automatically mean the loss of everything behind it. The front line trench was where you are now, the trench closest to the enemy, the one that faced no man's land, the one with the fire step and the parapet and the most immediate relationship with everything on the other side of the wire. This was the most dangerous trench and the most continuously occupied by the men who rotated through front line duty. Behind the front line was the support trench, typically 50 to 100 meters back, connected to the front line by short communication trenches, occupied by troops who were available to reinforce the front line if needed, and were slightly less immediately exposed to the frontline dangers. Behind the support trench was the reserve trench, further back, more substantially built in many cases, where troops rested between frontline rotations and where the heavier logistics of supply and reinforcement were managed. The communication trenches, the zigzagging passages that connected the front line to the support and reserve lines, and ultimately to the rear areas, were the arteries of the system. Everything moved through them. Men rotating in and out of the line, supplies coming forward, casualties going back, the various items of logistics that kept the system functioning. The communication trenches were typically less well built than the front line. They were passage rather than fighting position, and were correspondingly muddier, narrower, and more difficult to navigate. The physical construction of the trenches was supposed to follow a standard plan. The front line trench was supposed to be approximately 2 meters deep and wide enough for 2 men to pass each other, roughly 1.5 meters to 2 meters wide. The walls were supposed to be reinforced with sandbags on the parapet side and revetting material, wooden frames, corrugated iron, wicker panels on the interior sides. The floor was supposed to have wooden duckboards. The trench was supposed to zigzag, not run straight, at intervals to prevent enfilading fire. A single machine gun positioned at the end of a straight trench could fire down its entire length. A trench that turned every few meters limited this. Each section between turns was called a traverse. The word supposed is doing a significant amount of work in that paragraph. The trenches that existed in 1916, particularly in the most heavily contested sectors of the front, were often substantially different from the theoretical standard because they had been dug under fire, expanded under fire, repaired under fire, and were subject to the continuous physical assault of shell fire, rain, flooding, and the general entropy of structures, maintained by exhausted men with insufficient materials in conditions that were hostile to everything. The Ypres salient, the area around the Belgian city of Ypres, where British forces held a bulge in the front line that was surrounded on 3 sides by German-held high ground, was the most notorious for trench conditions. The geology of the Flemish plain, with its high water table and heavy clay soil, meant that any hole dug below a certain depth immediately filled with water. Trenches in the Ypres sector couldn't be dug to standard depth. They filled. The solution was to build upward instead of downward. The breastwork trench, where sandbag walls were constructed above the existing ground level to provide the necessary protection with only a shallow cut below. These breastwork trenches were, if anything, more vulnerable to the structural damage of shell fire than dug trenches because there was no soil depth to absorb the blast. The mud of the Ypres salient is the most famous mud of the Western Front, and it deserves its reputation. The Flemish clay, when thoroughly saturated, which it was for most of the year, became a substance of specific, unpleasant properties. It was sticky in a way that made movement through it exhausting. It was heavy in a way that made removing a foot from it an exercise in sustained effort. It was deep in the shell craters. The water-filled craters of the salient were genuinely dangerous because a man who fell into a deep crater could sink in the mud at its bottom before he could be pulled out, and the historical record contains cases of exactly this happening. The mud you're standing in, wherever exactly on the front we've placed you, is not the Ypres mud at its worst, but it is genuine trench mud, which means it is wet enough to submerge the duckboards partially, cold enough to leach heat from your feet through your boots, and comprehensive enough in its presence to coat everything: your boots, your puttees, the lower portions of your uniform, your hands when you touch the walls, your equipment when it contacts the ground. Everything in the trench is muddy. This is not an exaggeration. There is nothing in the trench that has escaped the mud's attention. The rifles are muddy. Cleaning them is a constant and important task, because a muddy rifle is a rifle that might jam at the precise moment you most need it not to. The rations are muddy if they've been dropped. The men are muddy. The officers are muddy. The rats are presumably muddy though the rats seem to manage the mud with considerably more equanimity than the humans. The rats. Let's talk about the rats, because the rats of the Western Front are one of those details that appear in every account, and that no amount of prior knowledge quite prepares you for the actual present reality of them. The trenches were inhabited by rats. Not a few rats, not an occasional rat. A population of rats of a scale that the trench environment had created and sustained through the sustained provision of everything that rats require. Food in the form of discarded rations, and more significantly, the bodies of the dead in no man's land, and in the shell craters, and shelter in the form of the trench walls, the dugouts, the spaces beneath the duckboards. The rats of the Western Front were large. Accounts consistently describe them as having grown to an exceptional size, which is biologically plausible given the abundance of food available to them. And bold in the way of animals that have learned through experience that the humans around them are not going to do anything effectively about their presence. They moved through the trenches in the open at all hours. They ran across sleeping men. They investigated equipment and rations with the focused, unhurried attention of creatures that know they are not going to be successfully deterred. Killing rats was a recreational activity for soldiers when they had the time and the energy for it, and the methods employed, bayonets, entrenching tool handles, improvised clubs, were applied with a genuine enthusiasm that tells you something about the men's relationship with the rat population. Cats were occasionally kept in trenches for rat control, and dogs were sometimes present. The effect on the rat population was local and temporary. The population's fundamental resource base, the dead of the Western Front, was not something that cats or dogs or bayonets could address at scale. The rats were a psychological presence as well as a physical one. The knowledge that the rats were eating the bodies in no man's land, that the large, bold, well-fed rats running across your sleeping body had been, hours before, at the bodies of men who had not survived the last action, was a knowledge that men in the trenches carried and did not generally discuss. It was one of those things that the trench code of practical stoicism, the collective unspoken agreement to keep functioning by not dwelling on the most disturbing features of the environment. Covered with a layer of dark humor and deliberate non-attention, you are dwelling on it right now because you don't have the trench code yet. You haven't had time to build it. The rats are present and you are aware of what they mean in the specific way that you can't help being aware of something when you don't have the developed habituation that makes it ignorable. The corporal from Lancashire, who has the developed habituation, watches you watching a rat cross the duckboards and says nothing. He has had this specific thought before. He decided at some point in his first weeks in the trench that the thought was not useful and stopped having it. He cannot explain to you how he did this because it is not a process he consciously managed. You are going to have to figure it out yourself. The smell of the trench is the other thing that no amount of prior knowledge prepares you for. The trench smell was distinctive enough that veterans described it consistently across accounts, a combination of specific elements that added up to something that had no equivalent in civilian experience. The mud contributed the baseline, the specific smell of disturbed earth and standing water, and the organic material decomposing in the soil. On top of this, the smell of unwashed men in wet wool, sweat, and damp fabric, and the specific human smell of people who have not bathed in weeks. The latrines cut into the trench walls, as simple sump pits, covered with a board, inadequate for the volume of use they received, contributed their own presence to the olfactory environment. The high explosive from the shells contributed a specific chemical note, the cordite from the rifles, the brazier smoke from the small fires that men lit when they could, burning whatever fuel came to hand. And underneath all of this, in the Ypres salient, or in the sectors near the major battle areas of the Somme, the specific smell that no account euphemizes away. The smell of the dead in no man's land. The dead who couldn't be recovered, who had been there for days or weeks or months, who were part of the landscape, now in the specific, irreversible way that the Western Front made its dead part of the landscape. You are smelling this right now. You're going to smell it for the rest of your day. By the end of the day, You will have stopped noticing it in the active way you're noticing it now, because the olfactory system adapts to sustained stimuli, and the brain reduces the attention devoted to a persistent smell over time. This is biology being merciful. The men who had been here for months had reached this adaptation completely, which meant they could function without the smell demanding their continuous attention. You have not reached it yet. You are going to spend the morning being intermittently distracted by it. This is going to be one of the smaller problems of your day. Chapter 3. The body. What the trench environment did to human physiology. Let's talk about what the trench was doing to your body, because this is where the gap between a bad environment to be in and an environment that was systematically destroying its inhabitants becomes most concrete. The most famous trench-specific medical condition was trench foot, and it deserves extended attention because it was both extremely common and extremely unpleasant in ways that the clinical name doesn't quite capture. Trench foot, known medically as non-freezing cold injury, or NFCI, was the result of feet being subjected to wet and cold conditions for extended periods without adequate opportunity to dry and warm. The mechanism is straightforward. Prolonged exposure to cold, wet conditions reduces blood flow to the extremities, starving the tissue of oxygen and nutrients. The damage this causes is cumulative and accelerating. The longer the exposure, the more severe the injury, and the progression from mild to severe happened over the course of days in the trench conditions of 1915 and 1916. The early stages of trench foot felt to the person experiencing them like their feet had gone numb. This numbness was deceptive. It felt like the cold was simply suppressing sensation in the normal way that cold suppresses sensation. But the tissue was being damaged in ways that the numbness concealed. Men walked on feet that were being destroyed without feeling the destruction, because the nerve damage that was part of the injury eliminated the pain signal that would have indicated something was wrong. When the foot was finally warmed, when the man was rotated out of the line, when his boots came off, when circulation returned, the damage became apparent and extremely painful. The feet that had been numb swelled. They turned red, then dark. In moderate cases, blisters formed and broke, and the damaged tissue recovered over weeks of careful nursing. In severe cases, the tissue had been damaged beyond recovery, and the outcome was gangrene. And the outcome of gangrene in a limb in 1916 was amputation. The British Army lost over 74,000 men to trench foot during the war. Not killed, but put out of action for weeks or months by a condition that was, once the causation was understood, largely preventable through the simple mechanism of keeping feet drier and changing into dry socks regularly. The early response to trench foot in 1914 and 1915 was inadequate, partly because the Army command didn't fully understand the mechanism, and partly because the logistics of supplying adequate dry socks to the front line were not initially prioritized. The prevention measures that were eventually implemented: whale oil rubbed on the feet to waterproof them, regular sock changes, pairs of socks were a significant component of trench logistics, officers tasked with inspecting their men's feet daily, reduced but did not eliminate trench foot as a significant source of casualties. Your feet right now are wet. They have been wet since you arrived. Your boots, standard British Army issue of the period, are not waterproof in the way that modern boots with modern waterproofing technologies are waterproof. They are leather boots that were treated with waterproofing compounds that are in the conditions of the Western Front, fighting a losing battle against the volume of water they're being asked to exclude. The mud has gotten into the seams. The water has worked through the leather. Your socks are wet. How long have your feet been wet? A few hours since you arrived before dawn. Trench foot doesn't develop in a few hours, but it develops over days. And if you were staying in the line for the standard rotation, typically 4 to 6 days in the front line, trench before rotation to the support or reserve line, your feet would be progressing through the early stages of injury by the time you rotated out. You are here for 1 day, so you are not going to develop full trench foot, but your feet are currently in the conditions that cause it, and the early sensation, the cold, the numbness beginning at the extremities, the vague sense that the connection between your brain and your feet is slightly less crisp than it should be, is present and real. The other trench-specific conditions were less famous, but equally present. Trench fever, a bacterial infection transmitted by body lice, was responsible for significant casualties throughout the war. The lice themselves were a ubiquitous feature of trench life, present on virtually every man in the line. They lived in the seams of clothing, emerging at night to feed, producing an incessant itching that disrupted sleep, and occupied a significant portion of the soldiers' resting time in the form of chatting, the searching and killing of lice in the clothing seams, a meditative activity that men engaged in during quiet periods with the focused attention that the importance and tedium of the task combined to produce. You have lice. This is simply a fact of your presence in the trench. They arrived on your body through contact with the clothing, the blankets, the men around you, with the efficiency of an organism that has been co-evolving with human populations for long enough to be very good at this. You may not have noticed them yet. Their presence is initially subtle, a background itch that could be attributed to any number of other sources. You will become more aware of them as the day progresses, and very aware of them at night when they are most active. The trench fever that the lice transmitted, caused by Bartonella quintana bacteria, produced a recurring fever that came in 5-day cycles. The quintana in the name refers to this pattern, accompanied by headache, muscle pain, and the general debilitating experience of a significant febrile illness. Trench fever itself was rarely fatal, but it was incapacitating. A man with trench fever was a man who couldn't fight, and the recurring nature of the illness meant that it disrupted military capacity for extended periods. The combination of trench foot, trench fever, and the various other infections and conditions that the trench environment enabled. Impetigo from the skin infections of unwashed men in dirty environments, the respiratory conditions that the cold and damp promoted, the digestive conditions that followed from food and water that weren't as clean as they should have been, meant that the medical casualty rate from disease and environmental injury was substantial alongside the combat casualty rate. The British Army in France in 1916 was, as one historian put it, slowly being damaged by the environment even when it was not being directly assaulted by the enemy. The trench was not a neutral location where men waited for battle. It was an active source of physical harm, operating continuously on the bodies of the men it contained. Let's talk about your sleep, because sleep in the trench is one of the more revealing demonstrations of what the environment demanded of its inhabitants. You did not sleep last night, or rather you slept in the specific way that is available in the trench at night, in short, interrupted periods, in a dugout, or in the open trench, when a dugout wasn't available, in conditions of cold and damp, and the continuous background noise of the front that ensured that sleep was never the deep, restorative process that the body needs it to be. The dugout was the shelter dug into the trench wall. The holes cut horizontally into the soil behind the parapet, reinforced with timber and corrugated iron and sandbags, providing a space that was out of the rain and out of the most immediate exposure to shell splinters. Dugouts varied enormously in their quality and comfort. At the German lines, where the German army had made the strategic decision to hold its current positions and had invested accordingly in building deep, well-constructed dugouts, the underground shelters were substantial, deep enough to be relatively safe from all but the heaviest shells, large enough to accommodate significant numbers of men, sometimes equipped with electric lighting, wooden floors, and other amenities that made them genuinely livable. The British dugouts were generally less impressive, partly because British tactical doctrine assumed that positions were temporary. The next advance would move the line forward, so there was no point in building permanent infrastructure, and partly because the geology of certain sectors didn't permit deep excavation. A typical British frontline dugout was a hole cut a meter or two into the trench wall, large enough for 2 or 3 men to sit or lie in, reinforced with whatever timber was available, covered with a sheet of corrugated iron and a layer of sandbags for overhead protection that was adequate against shrapnel but not against a direct shell hit. In the dugout or in the trench, if no dugout space was available, you slept in rotation. The trench was never entirely unmanned, even at night. The sentries maintained their watch. The Lewis gun posts were manned. The listening posts, the small outposts, sometimes pushed forward into no man's land to listen for. Enemy movement were occupied. The men who weren't on duty slept when they could in the positions available to them. The sleep you managed last night was not good sleep. It was cold interrupted, noise interrupted, rat interrupted sleep, in a cramped position on a surface that was not designed for human comfort, in wet clothing that conducted heat away from your body faster than your body could produce it. You woke up tired in the way that you wake up after sleep that was technically sleep, but was not, functionally rest. This is your baseline condition for the day. Tired, wet, cold, feet going numb, beginning to itch. Having eaten a meal that was nutritionally adequate, but gastronomically dispiriting. This is not your worst condition of the day. This is your starting point. Chapter 4. The work. What soldiers actually did. All day in the trenches here is the thing that popular culture gets most wrong about the trenches. The popular image of the Western Front is of continuous, intense combat. Men going over the top, advancing across no man's land, machine gun fire, shell fire, the immediate drama of battle. This image is not wrong exactly. All of those things happened, but it radically misrepresents the temporal distribution of trench life. The reality was something that the men in the trenches expressed with a specific black humor. The trenches were 90% boredom and 10% terror, and the 90% was almost as hard to survive as the 10%. Most of your day in the trenches is not going to be dramatic. It is going to be work, the continuous, unglamorous, essential work of maintaining the trench system in a state that keeps it functional and keeps you alive. Let's walk through what the working day in the trenches actually looked like after the morning stand-to and the rum ration and the lukewarm breakfast. The first and most continuous task was maintenance. The trench was being destroyed at all times by a combination of shell fire, erosion, and the simple physical assault of sustained occupation by many men in wet conditions. The sandbags on the parapet absorbed water and deteriorated. Shell fragments tore holes in the revetting. The duckboards shifted and sank and broke. The walls slumped and narrowed. The drainage failed. The trench was always in the process of gradual disintegration, and the response to this disintegration was continuous manual labor. You are going to dig today. This is not optional. The trench requires maintenance, and maintenance requires men with entrenching tools. And you are a man with an entrenching tool. And the section of trench that your corporal is indicating with a pointed finger is the section that needs attention today. The entrenching tool, the short-handled folding spade that was standard British Army issue, was not designed for the sustained, heavy digging that the trench system required. It was designed as a personal tool for hasty field fortification, for a soldier to quickly dig a scrape or a firing position in the field. The daily maintenance of the trench system required heavier tools, full-length spades and picks and shovels that were kept as trench stores, plus the ubiquitous entrenching tools of the men themselves, applied to the problem in combination. You dig. The soil, or rather the mud, responds to the spade with the specific consistency of something that doesn't have strong opinions about its own shape, and is happy to return to whatever position gravity recommends. Moving mud in a trench is less about shifting a defined material from one location to another, and more about the continuous renegotiation of the boundary between the mud and the not mud. A negotiation in which the mud has a structural advantage because it has gravity and volume and patience on its side. An hour of digging. Your arms and shoulders have opinions. Your back has opinions. The mud that you have moved from one position to another is already beginning to re-examine its options between the digging, sandbagging, filling sandbags with mud, a process that sounds straightforward and is in practice somewhat complicated by the mud's reluctance to stay in the sandbag until the bag is tied, and by the sheer weight of a filled sandbag when you're trying to position it on a parapet while standing in mud yourself. and placing them where the parapet or the traverse needs reinforcement. A filled sandbag weighed approximately 25 kilograms. You are lifting these, positioning them, and stacking them in configurations that the corporal is directing with the specific precision of a man who knows what a properly built parapet looks like and has opinions about shortcuts. There is also wire to deal with. The wire in front of the trench, the belts of concertina wire, and barbed wire that constituted the primary anti-infantry obstacle required maintenance and repair. Wire was damaged by shell fire and by the patrols that moved through no man's land at night, cutting gaps for their own access. Repairing wire was done at night because doing it in daylight was suicidal. A man in no man's land putting up wire stakes and unwinding wire was visible, and a visible man in no man's land had a very poor prognosis. The wire repair parties that went out at night did their work in the dark, by feel as quietly as possible, hoping that the sentry on the other side was looking somewhere else. You're not going to be doing wire repair today, because it happens at night, and because it requires a specific set of skills and knowledge about the patterns of the wire and the positions of the enemy that you don't have. But the men around you are aware of when the next wire repair party is scheduled and who is on it, and their awareness of this fact is visible in the way that people are aware of unpleasant things they are scheduled to do. The water. The trench water was a constant management problem, and the management required continuous effort. The pumps, hand-operated or small mechanical pumps, that were supposed to keep the drainage sumps clear required operation and maintenance. When the pumps were working, the water level in the trench could be kept to manageable levels. When they weren't, which was a regular occurrence because the pumps were mechanical objects in an environment specifically hostile to mechanical objects, the water accumulated rapidly. You spend a period of the morning on pump duty. The hand pump is a simple lever mechanism, operated by repeated up and down motion, moving water from the drainage sump in the trench floor into a channel that directs it away behind the trench line. This sounds straightforward and is, in execution, a relentless physical task that is exhausting in the specific way of sustained repetitive effort without the variety that makes sustained effort bearable. Up, down, down. The water moves. More. Water takes its place. The mud provides additional water from the walls by seepage. The process is, in the strictest sense, Sisyphean, though the Sisyphean quality is a feature rather than a bug. The point is not to empty the trench, but to keep the water below a level that makes the trench non-functional. Between the physical maintenance tasks, sentry duty. Each section of the front line was manned by sentries whose job was to watch no man's land and sound the alarm if enemy movement was observed. Sentry duty during daylight was done through the periscope, a simple device that allowed observation over the parapet without exposing the observer's head to enemy snipers, rather than by direct observation over the top, because direct observation in daylight was precisely as dangerous as it sounds. The periscope was a wooden or metal box with two mirrors set at 45-degree angles, allowing the viewer standing in the trench to see what was on the other side of the parapet without being visible to the enemy. The view it provided was limited. The field of view was narrow and the image was not high quality. But it was the difference between doing sentry duty and dying doing sentry duty, which made it rather popular. Sniper. We need to talk about snipers, because snipers were one of the most significant and most psychologically distinctive dangers of the trench environment, and they shaped the behavior of everyone in the trenches in specific and important ways. The German army invested in sniping early in the war, developing specialized units of trained marksmen equipped with high-quality rifles with telescopic sights, positioned in carefully prepared hides in no man's land or in the German trenches, watching the British line for exposed targets. The effectiveness of German sniping in the early years of the war was significant. Men who exposed their heads above the parapet in daylight were at real and serious risk of being shot. This created a specific behavioral adaptation in trench life. The rule that you do not put your head above the parapet in daylight under any circumstances without a very good reason and the specific preparation for the risk it involves. The periscope was the behavioral response. Surveillance without exposure. The indirect fire over the parapet was another. Weapons positioned to fire without the shooter being exposed. The entire topography of the trench was organized around the assumption that anything exposed above the parapet line in daylight was at risk. The famous story, told in various versions across the memoirs and accounts of the Western Front, of the soldier who raised his head above the parapet in curiosity and was immediately shot by a sniper, is not an urban legend. It happened. It happened often enough to be one of the standard cautionary stories of the induction into trench life, told by experienced men to new arrivals, with the specific directness of people conveying information whose importance is not hypothetical. The corporal from Lancashire told you this story this morning. He told it in the brief, uninflected way of someone delivering a safety briefing that they have given many times and whose importance they don't need to dramatize, because the facts are dramatic enough on their own. You have not raised your head above the parapet. You're not going to raise your head above the parapet. This is in the context of all the other things that are happening to you today, the one instruction you have followed perfectly and without difficulty. Chapter 5. The Shell Fire. The Sound and the Physics of Artillery. It is now mid-morning, and the artillery has started. The artillery has, in fact, been intermittently active since before dawn. The Western Front was never entirely quiet, and the background of distant artillery was so constant that experienced men had learned to process it as background noise, in the same way you process traffic or weather. But what's happening now is different from the background. What's happening now is close, and getting closer, and the specific character of the incoming sound tells the men around you something specific that their experience has taught them to read. You cannot read it yet. Let's explain what they know. The artillery shell produces two distinct sounds when it passes close enough to be personally relevant. First, the sound of the gun firing, the distant thud of the propellant charge, which arrives delayed by the speed of sound from however far away the enemy battery is. And second, the incoming shell itself, which you hear before you hear the gun because the shell is supersonic and arrives ahead of its own sound. The incoming shell sounds like tearing cloth, or a freight train, or, and this is the description that appears most consistently in the accounts, like a very large piece of air being moved very quickly in a direction you would prefer it not to be moved. After the incoming sound, the impact, if the shell lands in soft mud, which it often does, because the ground in front of the trenches was thoroughly churned and waterlogged, the explosion is partially absorbed, reduced from the maximum blast by the mud's dampening effect. If it lands on harder ground, or on a trench, the full force of the explosion is available. You are right now hearing incoming shells, and the specific knowledge that the men around you have, and you don't, is, where is it landing relative to this section of trench? Is it walking toward us, or walking away? Is the pattern suggesting registration fire, the enemy calibrating their guns on a target, or the beginning of a sustained bombardment? The corporal from Lancashire has made a specific assessment in approximately 2 seconds from the sound of the first incoming shells. His assessment has been communicated to the men around him in the form of a single word: dugout. The men are moving toward the dugout with the unhurried efficiency of people who have done this many times and know that panic is slower than calm, purposeful movement. You are moving with them. Good. The dugout is not safe. No position in the front line. Trench is safe from a direct hit, and the British dugouts of this period were not deep enough to guarantee safety from heavy shells. But the dugout offered significant protection against the most common form of artillery casualty: shell fragments. A shell that burst within 50 meters of an open trench could put fragments into every man in that section. A shell that burst in the same proximity to men in a dugout would typically not reach them unless it landed on or very near the dugout entrance. You are in the dugout. It is small. 3 men can sit in it if they are comfortable with each other's proximity, which you are becoming, because there are 4 of you. And the 4th is solving the geometry problem with the practical creativity of someone who has solved it before. The corrugated iron above your head and the sandbags above that are providing the protection available. The smell is concentrated. You're in a small enclosed space with 3 men who have been in the trench for 6 days. You can hear the shells landing, close enough that the impacts transmit through the soil as physical vibration. You feel them as much as hear them, a dull concussion that moves through the ground under you and through the walls of the dugout around you. Loose soil falls from the ceiling of the dugout with each nearby impact. The corrugated iron vibrates. The experience of being under shell fire in a dugout was described by the men who survived it with a specific vocabulary that returns again and again across different accounts. The helplessness, the inability to respond, to act, to do anything at all that would affect the outcome. In infantry fighting, there was agency. You could move, you could return fire, you could make decisions that affected your situation. Under shell fire in a dugout, there was nothing to do except wait and hope that the specific shell with your specific name on it. The phrase was in common use, and it expressed a genuine philosophical relationship with the randomness of artillery. Was not in the current bombardment. The randomness was real and was one of the most psychologically difficult aspects of the trench experience. The men who died in shell fire had typically done nothing wrong. They had been in the wrong place at the moment a shell arrived, and no amount of skill, experience, or caution had the power to have moved them out of that place. The man in the trench next to the one who died might have survived on the basis of a few feet of distance or a few seconds of timing that were entirely outside his control. This randomness violated the intuitive human model of survival, the model in which doing the right things keeps you safe. In the trenches, doing the right things helped at the margins, but didn't protect you from the fundamental lottery of artillery. This was psychologically destabilizing in ways that the men in the trenches managed through a range of mechanisms. Fatalism. If your name's on the shell, it's on the shell. Nothing you can do. Dark humor. The shell that you hear isn't the one that gets you. The ones that get you, you don't hear. And the deliberate suppression of the thought. The turning of attention to the immediate and manageable. In the dugout, you are having the thoughts. All of them. The lottery, the randomness, the loose soil falling from the ceiling, the physical vibration of each impact. You are having them without the mechanisms that would make them manageable, because those mechanisms take time to develop, and you haven't had the time. The man beside you, not the corporal who is doing his ceiling examination as stress management, is a private from Birmingham who is approximately 19 years old and has been in the line for 3 months. He is sitting with his arms on his knees and his head slightly forward, in a posture that is clearly familiar and clearly something he has settled into before. He is not engaging with the thoughts. He is in some other place through the specific discipline of mental management that the trench environment required and that 3 months had given him some skill in. You are looking at him because looking at him is more useful than looking at the ceiling, and he notices this and looks back at you with the specific expression of someone who knows what you're going through and doesn't have anything helpful to say about it that he hasn't already said to himself many times. He says, "It'll stop." He is not wrong. It stops. The bombardment, a registered fire by German artillery on a section of the trench that they have targeted, probably in anticipation of a trench raid tonight, lasts approximately 40 minutes. When it stops, the silence that follows is relative. The background artillery continues, but the personal, immediate, "this is landing near you" quality disappears, and the relative silence is so much better than what preceded it that it feels briefly peaceful. The damage assessment begins. Men emerge from the dugout and other shelters, checking the trench, checking each other. In this section, the bombardment produced 2 men wounded by shell fragments, one seriously, one less so, and a significant section of parapet collapsed that needs immediate repair before the next stand-to, because a collapsed parapet is a gap in the defensive line that the enemy might notice and exploit. 2 wounded men from a 40-minute bombardment of one section of one trench. Across the entire front, on a moderately active day, the arithmetic of this scales rapidly. The wounded are moved toward the rear, through the communication trench, toward the aid post, where the stretcher bearers, and the medical orderlies, who are the first layer of the medical system, will assess them and begin the process of evacuation toward the dressing stations and eventually the casualty clearing stations behind the line. The men moving them are not delicate about the process, not out of callousness, but out of the specific urgency of moving casualties through a narrow trench in which delicacy is not geometrically possible. You help with this. It is the first time in your day that you have been in immediate, direct contact with the consequences of the artillery, and the encounter with a man who has shell fragments in his leg is different from knowing abstractly that shells wound people. The man is in pain, which he is expressing in the specific way of a person who is trying to be less in pain than he is. The leg is bleeding, controlled by a field dressing applied by the man's partner before you arrived. The man is conscious, oriented, going to survive this in all probability. You help move him. This is not technically difficult. It is the kind of thing you can do without special knowledge or training. You do it. This is today's contribution to the effort so far, and it is more useful than anything else you've managed. Chapter 6. The afternoon. Rations, boredom, and the specific texture of waiting. The bombardment is over. The parapet is being repaired. The 2 wounded men are somewhere in the communication trench, being moved toward the rear. The corporal from Lancashire is directing the sandbagging with the focused energy of a man who has a specific standard in mind and intends to achieve it regardless of what the day has thrown at the section so far. You are hungry. This is not a small fact. The breakfast you had this morning, the lukewarm stew from the mess tin, was adequate in the technical sense of containing calories, but it was several hours ago, and the physical work of the morning has been considerable. Your body is registering its interest in additional fuel with the specific urgency of a system that has been running hard on inadequate input. The midday meal is coming, eventually. The logistics of feeding men in the front-line trench were one of the more complex organizational challenges of trench warfare, and understanding them explains both what you're going to eat and why it's going to arrive in the condition it arrives in. The field kitchen was established in the rear area, typically a kilometer or more behind the front line, far enough that the smoke of cooking fires didn't provide a visible target for enemy artillery. The food prepared there was hot when it left. It then had to be transported forward through the communication trenches to the front line. A journey of between 30 minutes and 2 hours, depending on the length and condition of the communication trench, the traffic moving in both directions through it, and the various obstacles that the trench environment put in the way of anyone trying to move through it efficiently. The containers used for transporting food, insulated containers called dixies, essentially large lidded pots, were not adequate to maintain temperature over these journey times. The food arrived at the front line at a temperature that was significantly below what it had been when it left the kitchen, and in a condition that the journey through the communication trench had not improved. Today's midday meal is a stew of some kind, containing identifiable pieces of bully beef, the tinned corned beef that was a staple of British Army rations in the First World War, and less identifiable pieces of vegetable, in a gravy that has thickened somewhat during the journey to a consistency that is approaching porridge. There is bread, hardtack biscuits, the dense dry biscuits that were essentially indestructible and only marginally edible without liquid to soften them. There is tea. The tea is the one thing that has survived the journey, in something approaching adequate condition. The British Army's relationship with tea in the First World War was not merely cultural, it was logistical and physiological. A hot or warm beverage in the conditions of the trench was one of the primary mechanisms for maintaining the core body temperature of men who were being continuously cooled by wet and cold and insufficient shelter. Tea was taken seriously as a morale and welfare item at institutional levels that extended far up the command chain, and the system for ensuring that tea reached the front line was, by the standards of the rest of the supply system, relatively reliable. You drink the tea with the gratitude of someone for whom a warm beverage is the best thing that has happened today. It is strong and sweet, The British Army tea of this period was typically brewed strong and served with generous quantities of sugar, the sweetness providing immediate energy alongside the warmth. It is, relative to everything else that the day has offered, excellent. The stew is eaten. The hardtack biscuits are eaten after being dipped in the remaining tea, long enough to soften them to the point where eating them does not feel like consuming compressed building material. The entire meal takes approximately 15 minutes, conducted in the sections of trench that have been cleared of the morning's maintenance activity, sitting on whatever is available: the fire step, an ammunition box, the edge of a drainage sump. The men eat with the efficient, unhurried attention of people who have learned to take meals seriously as one of the limited sources of genuine satisfaction available in the trench environment. The food is not good, the meals are nonetheless important. Not just nutritionally, but as structure, as punctuation in the day, as one of the points around which the formless time of the trench organized itself. The formless time is the next problem, because after the maintenance work and the bombardment and the casualty evacuation and the midday meal, there is the afternoon, and the afternoon in the trenches on a relatively quiet day, which today is, by the standards of the sector, is characterized by something that doesn't appear in the popular mythology of the Western Front: boredom. Profound, sustained, structurally enforced boredom of a kind that has no civilian equivalent. The boredom of an environment where the options are: maintain the trench, perform your duty rotation, or wait, where you cannot leave, where movement is constrained by the ever-present threat of the sniper, where the entertainment available to you consists of whatever you are capable of carrying into the trench, and whatever conversation is possible with the men around you, where the specific quality of the waiting, the knowledge that something might happen at any moment, that the relative quiet of the afternoon could be interrupted without warning by shell fire, by a raid, by the order to stand to, prevented the deep relaxation that would have made the waiting bearable. It was boredom with a floor, and the floor was anxiety, and the combination was one of the more psychologically demanding features of trench life. The men had developed mechanisms for managing it, because the management of boredom in the trenches was as important as the management of any other threat to operational effectiveness. Letters, writing them, receiving them, reading them, were perhaps the most important single mechanism. The letter from home was a connection to a reality outside the trench that had real psychological value, and the men who received regular mail were measurably better off than those who didn't. Writing letters home was both a connection to the world outside the trench and a productive activity that occupied the unstructured time with something that felt purposeful. You don't have anyone to write to who exists in 1916. This is one of the more specific disadvantages of your temporal situation. The other mechanisms, cards, playing cards were widely distributed, and games were a significant feature of quiet periods in the trench. Reading, books and newspapers circulated through the trench system with the enthusiasm of items that have genuine value in a resource-scarce environment. Maintenance activities that were simultaneously useful and occupying. The cleaning of rifles, the searching of clothing for lice, the repair of personal equipment. Conversation, the specific particular conversation of men who have been confined together long enough to have exhausted most ordinary topics and have developed the kind of elliptical, reference-dense communication of people who share so much context that words carry more than their face value. You can participate in some of this. The cards are available, a battered deck that has clearly been through significant use, with 2 cards replaced by pieces of cut-up ration packaging that have the relevant suit and number written on them in pencil. The corporal from Lancashire is playing a hand with the private from Birmingham, and another man whose name you haven't learned yet. They deal you in with the wordless economy of men who have room for one more and don't need to discuss it. You play cards in a trench on the Western Front in 1916. The game is pontoon, a version of blackjack, and the stakes are cigarettes, because cigarettes are the currency of the trench economy in a more immediate sense than the actual British currency that technically applies. The cigarette ration was one of the most consistently maintained elements of the British Army's supply system, because the people running that system understood, through the specific practical wisdom of people managing the welfare of a very large group of men under extreme stress, that the cigarette was doing significant psychological work. Smoking in the trenches was nearly universal among the men, regardless of their pre-war habits. Not because the war had introduced them to nicotine, though for some it had, because the act of smoking, the physical ritual of it, the brief, focused pleasure of it, the social dimension of sharing a light and a smoke with the man beside you, provided a form of comfort and structure that the trench environment was otherwise designed to eliminate. The cigarette break was a moment of deliberate pleasure in an environment that offered very few deliberate pleasures. Men treated it with a seriousness that a civilian observer might find disproportionate to the object. The seriousness was entirely proportionate to the scarcity of alternatives. You smoke. You have not smoked before. Or perhaps you have. It depends on who you are. But if you haven't, now is not the time to maintain that particular personal choice in the face of the social reality of the trench. You smoke and play cards, and the afternoon passes in a way that is almost comfortable, in the way that almost is doing a lot of work but is still almost. The afternoon is interrupted periodically by a brief renewal of shell fire several hundred meters to the left, which everyone assesses as not their immediate problem, and which resolves without expanding. The arrival of the evening rations carried up through the communication trench by the ration party, a rotation of men from the support line who made this journey in the late afternoon, carrying the containers of food and the various other supplies the front line needed. A brief, pointed discussion between the corporal and another section about a shared responsibility for a section of trench that both claimed the other was responsible for maintaining, resolved through the specific authority hierarchy of the NCO rank that the corporal held. The mail comes with the rations, a bundle of letters and one package. The package is for the private from Birmingham, who receives it with the controlled enthusiasm of someone who has been expecting it and doesn't want to make a production of how much they were expecting it. He opens it later in the dugout, and it contains a fruitcake, somewhat compressed by its journey through the postal and logistics system, but intact, and recognizably a fruitcake. He shares it with the section without discussion, cutting it into pieces with his clasp knife, with the specific precision of a man who is making sure each piece is as equal as a fruitcake that has been somewhat compressed allows. The fruitcake is, in the context of the day's food, a transcendent experience. You eat your piece with the attention it deserves. This is one of the things the popular mythology also misses. The moments of genuine pleasure in the trench, the tea, the fruitcake, the card game, the dark joke that lands exactly right and produces genuine laughter, the letter from home, the moment when the sun came out, briefly, an hour ago, between the clouds, and for 15 minutes the trench was warm and bright, and the mud was almost golden in the afternoon light, and several men sat with their faces turned up to it with the specific wordless gratitude of people for whom warmth and light are not guaranteed. These moments existed. They were real. The men's accounts are full of them, alongside the horror and the fear and the boredom and the loss. Both things were true. The trench was a place of systematic suffering, and also a place where men found, in each other and in the small pleasures available to them, a quality of life that the conditions seemed designed to prevent. The resilience this represented was not exceptional courage. It was ordinary human adaptability, the same mechanism that allows people to find meaning and pleasure in difficult circumstances in every era and context, operating under extreme conditions. The men of the Western Front were not different in kind from anyone else. They were ordinary people managing extraordinary circumstances with the tools that ordinary people have, which turned out more often than not to be enough. Not always enough. We'll get to that. But more often than you'd expect. Chapter 7, The Night. No man's land after dark, and what darkness brought the sun has gone down. The transition from afternoon to evening in the trench was marked, as the transition from night to morning had been, by stand to. The dusk stand to, the mirror image of the morning one. The men on the fire step, watching the light fade over no man's land, while the specific evening anxiety ran through the line. Dusk Stand 2 was, by some accounts, worse than the morning version. The morning Stand 2 ended with the daylight arriving and making no man's land visible and empty. The Dusk Stand 2 ended with the darkness arriving and making no man's land invisible, and the invisibility of no man's land at night was not reassuring. It was the condition under which raids happened. It was the condition under which the various activities of the night, patrols, wire parties, listening posts, the movement of men between positions occurred, and the invisibility cut both ways. Stand down. The night begins. The night in the trenches was a different world from the day, with different dangers, different rhythms, and different demands. The daytime had been the sniper's dominion, the constraint of daylight that kept men below the parapet, that limited movement that made the trench a relatively static environment punctuated by shellfire and maintenance work. The night removed the sniper and replaced him with something more diffuse, and in some ways more psychologically difficult, the possibility of everything. In daylight, you knew where the danger was coming from the German line, from the artillery, from the specific and locatable sources of threat that the visible landscape organized. At night, no man's land was an unknown. The wire that was visible in daylight became a sound, the specific sound of wire being disturbed in the dark. The ground that you could see was replaced by the ground you could only hear. Every sound in no man's land at night was potentially significant, and the imagination's tendency to supply the worst interpretation of an ambiguous sound was one of the most exhausting features of night sentry duty. The sentries at night were listening and watching, or rather mostly listening, because the eyes in darkness have very limited range, while the ears can detect sound across a much larger area. The specific skill of the experienced night sentry was the ability to distinguish between the sounds of the trench environment that were background, the rats, the wind, the distant artillery, the various normal sounds of the occupied trench, and the sounds that were anomalous, that required attention, that might mean something was happening in no man's land that needed to be reported. You take a stint of night sentry. Duty. The instruction is, watch no man's land. Listen for any sound of movement or cutting of wire or unusual activity. Report anything to the corporal immediately. Do not fire without reason. A nervous sentry opening fire at shadows in no man's land produced exactly the kind of alert that both sides tried to avoid on quiet nights, when neither side was planning to raid the other. The not firing instruction is harder to follow than it sounds when you are standing on the fire step in the dark with your rifle, looking into a blackness that is doing the thing that blackness does to an anxious brain, which is to populate itself with shapes and movements that may or may not be there. The experienced sentry had developed a relationship with this phenomenon, the ability to look at a moving shadow and assess it as wind-moved wire rather than moving person, based on the specific character of the movement, the sound that accompanied it, the context of what was known about the sector. The inexperienced sentry, you, were working with none of this calibration. You do not fire. This is the correct decision, and you arrive at it not through the developed judgment of experience, but through the more reliable mechanism of being genuinely uncertain whether anything is there, which prevents you from committing to the action that uncertainty would require you to justify afterward. Nothing is there, or nothing comes of anything that is there. The hour of sentry duty passes in the specific suspended state of intense, exhausting attention to a darkness that returns nothing definitive. The relief comes. The next man takes the fire step. You step down into the trench with legs that have been tense for an hour, and a nervous system that has been running at an elevated state that it is now trying to stand down from, with the limited success of a system that doesn't have an off switch. Now let's talk about what else is happening in the night, in the sections of the line, where things are not quiet. The trench raid. The trench raid was one of the defining activities of the static phase of the Western Front, and it was one of the most feared and most hated experiences of trench warfare. A raid was a deliberate assault by a small party of men, typically between 10 and 50, on a section of the enemy trench, with the objectives of killing enemy soldiers, capturing prisoners for intelligence purposes, destroying enemy positions or equipment, and demonstrating the aggressive spirit that the High Command wanted the infantry to maintain during the periods when large-scale offensive operations were not underway. The raids were typically conducted at night, often after a brief artillery bombardment that was designed to stun the defenders and cut the wire, but which also eliminated the element of surprise. The raiding party went out through gaps in their own wire, crossed no man's land in the dark, a journey of between 100 and 300 meters, depending on the sector, cut or used gaps in the enemy wire, dropped into the enemy trench, and fought in the confined space of the trench itself with the tools that trench fighting in close quarters required. Those tools were not primarily rifles. The rifle, in the close space of a trench at night, was too long and too slow to load for the kind of fighting that a raid involved. Trench raids were fought with pistols, which were compact enough to use in confined spaces, trench clubs, wooden clubs, often with nails or metal studs embedded in them, produced in army workshops and distributed to raiding parties, grenades, the Mills bomb, the standard British hand grenade of the period, bayonets, the knives attached to the ends of rifles, which could be used separately as knives in close quarters fighting, and in some documented cases, implements that were not official military equipment but that soldiers had brought or made. Koshes, knuckle dusters, sharpened entrenching. Tools. The raid was, in the language of the High Command, an aggressive demonstration of fighting spirit. In the experience of the men who conducted them, it was organized violence of a particularly intense and personal kind, in the dark, in a confined space, against men who were defending their own trench. The casualty rates of raiding parties were significant. Raids were dangerous for the attackers as well as the defenders, and the combination of the exposed crossing of no man's land, the cutting of wire under fire, and the trench fighting itself meant that a successful raid often returned with significant losses. Your section is not raiding tonight. There is a raid planned. The bombardment this afternoon on the sector to your left was, you now understand from the corporal's explanation, a registration bombardment in preparation for a raid by a company from the battalion to your left. They are going over tonight. Their preparations, the gathering of the raiding party, the issue of special equipment, the final briefing from their officers, are happening somewhere along the line while you are doing your sentry duty. What comes back from that raid in the early hours of the morning will be some men, some with wounds, a German prisoner who looks younger than you expected, and who is being moved toward the rear with the specific controlled haste of a man who is valuable for the information he might provide, and gaps in the raiding party where men had been who are not coming back. You will not see most of this. You will see the prisoner briefly as he passes through your section of the trench, and the specific look on his face, 17 years old, or perhaps 19, clearly terrified, covered in the mud of the crossing and the fighting, will be one of the images of the day that you carry longest. He looks exactly like the men around you. He is wearing a different uniform and he is frightened in German, but everything else, the youth, the mud, the specific expression of someone who has been through something extreme and is now trying to process it while being moved through a hostile environment, is the same. You look at him for 3 seconds as he passes, and then he is gone around the traverse, and the moment closes. The night is also the time of the listening post. The listening post was one of the more exposed duties of trench life. A small position, typically occupied by 2 men, pushed forward of the front line, wire into no man's land itself, close enough to the enemy wire to be able to hear activity in the enemy trenches. The listeners were there to provide early warning of any enemy activity. A raiding party forming up in the enemy trench, wire being cut, the sounds of unusual movement that might precede an attack. The listening post at night was, by the accounts of the men who occupied it, one of the most psychologically demanding duties of trench life. You were in no man's land. On both sides of you was wire. Behind you was the British front line, close but not visible in the dark, and the direction back to it required accurate navigation in conditions where navigational references were sparse and getting lost had serious consequences. Ahead of you was the German wire, and beyond that, the German trench. You were lying in the mud of no man's land, as still as possible, listening. The rules of the listening post were absolute. No movement that could be heard, no light, no sound. You were there to listen, not to be detected. If the enemy sent out their own patrol, and it came near your listening post, the instruction was to remain still and hope. If they came close enough that remaining still was not an option, the situation became one that required judgment, speed, and the specific preparation that the men of the listening post had been given, and that you have not. You are not on listening post duty tonight. The corporal from Lancashire made this assessment without explaining it to you, which you are accepting with a gratitude that you are not expressing, because expressing it would require acknowledging that you're relieved about not doing something that you should be capable of doing, which is the kind of thought that doesn't improve anyone's evening. The night stretches. The sentry rotations continue. In the quiet periods between duties, the men sleep in the dugout in the specific, rotation-managed way of a system that ensures the trench is never unmanned while ensuring that no man is on continuous duty indefinitely. Sleep, as we've established, is available in the technical sense, and adequate in the functional sense only barely. You sleep in the dugout, in the dark, with the rats moving somewhere in the walls, and the distant artillery providing its constant background, and the specific cold of a night, in a trench working at your body, with the patience of a physical process that has unlimited time. At some point in the night, the gas alarm sounds. Chapter 8. The gas. The specific horror of chemical weapons on the Western Front. The gas alarm is a klaxon, a hand-operated rattle, or a piece of shell casing being struck as a bell, depending on what's available in this section. And the sound of it, at 2:30 in the morning, produces in the men of the trench a response that is both immediate and specific. The response is, gas mask, now. The gas mask, the small box respirator, the standard British gas protection equipment from 1916 onward, was carried by every man in the trench in a box worn on the chest, ready for immediate access. The instruction was to have it on within 7 seconds of the alarm. 7 seconds. The specificity of this number was not arbitrary. It was calculated from the effects of the gases in use, particularly chlorine and phosgene, and the concentration at which immediate inhalation was dangerous. 7 seconds was how long you had. You have been briefed on the gas mask. You were shown how it works. You have not practiced putting it on in the dark, half asleep, with cold and stiff fingers, in the specific confined space of a dugout, while the men around you are doing the same thing, with the automatic speed of practice. And you are doing it with the deliberate, conscious effort of someone working through a procedure they learned this morning. You get it on, not in 7 seconds, possibly in 15, possibly in 20. The mask is on. The seal is checked against your face with the specific, desperate precision of a man who knows what an inadequate seal means, and you are breathing through the filter. Breathing through the small box respirator was an experience that the men of the Western Front described consistently and specifically. The filter, a canister of activated charcoal and other materials that absorbed the gases, imposed a resistance on each breath. You could breathe, but each breath required effort. The effort was not enormous, but it was sustained, and sustained effort in breathing is one of those things that draws attention in a way that can't be easily ignored. The mask also fogged, the exhaled breath, warmer than the ambient air, condensed on the eyepieces, and reduced visibility. And the mask was hot. The rubber facepiece, sealed against the skin, trapped heat in a way that became uncomfortable rapidly. Men wore the mask for as long as the gas threat persisted. The all clear, when it came, when the concentration in the air had dropped below dangerous levels, was checked by the gas NCO with litmus paper and experienced before the order to remove masks was given. Let's talk about the gas itself, because the popular understanding of chemical weapons in the First World War often reduces them to a single image: men in masks in a cloud of green gas that misses the specific, varied, and systematically horrifying nature of the chemical weapons program that both sides developed across the war. The first large-scale gas attack of the war, the German chlorine attack at Ypres in April 1915, released approximately 168 tons of chlorine gas from cylinders positioned in the front line trenches. The cloud moved on the prevailing wind toward the French and Canadian troops holding that section of the line. The troops who saw the greenish-yellow cloud and didn't know what it was held their positions initially. Then the cloud reached them, and the chlorine, a pulmonary agent that reacts with moisture in the lungs to form hydrochloric acid, began its work. Chlorine caused immediate coughing, choking, burning in the throat and lungs. In high concentrations, it was rapidly incapacitating and potentially fatal. The lungs filled with fluid. The victim drowned in the fluid produced by the chemical reaction in their own respiratory tract. Men who survived the initial exposure suffered pulmonary damage that could be permanent. The immediate effect on the troops at Ypres was a gap in the line. Men who had survived fled, and the Germans advanced through the gap before. Ultimately, the advance stalled for lack of reserves. The British Army developed gas protection in response. Initially, the improvised expedient of a cloth soaked in water or urine held over the nose and mouth, then progressively better equipment as the chemistry and the threat were better understood. The small box respirator that you are wearing tonight was the product of this development process and was, by 1916, genuinely effective against the gases in use at the time. But the chemical weapons program did not stand still. Each improvement in protection was followed by the development of new agents designed to defeat or circumvent the protection. The gas war was, in microcosm, the same dynamic as the broader weapon development pattern of the First World War. A continuous technical competition between offensive capability and defensive response. Phosgene, introduced in 1915, was more dangerous than chlorine. It had less immediate effect, which made it paradoxically more lethal. A man who breathed phosgene might feel relatively little at first, then deteriorate and die 24 to 48 hours later from the accumulated damage to the lungs. The delayed effect made it harder to respond to immediately and allowed more exposure before the victim recognized the danger. Mustard gas, introduced by Germany in 1917, technically outside our 1916 time frame, but important enough to describe, was different in character from both chlorine and phosgene. It was not primarily a pulmonary agent. It was a vesicant, a blister agent, that caused chemical burns to any skin, eye, or respiratory tissue it contacted. Mustard gas was persistent. It remained active in the soil and on surfaces for days after its release, contaminating an area in ways that chlorine and phosgene, which dispersed, did not. Men who walked through mustard contaminated ground. Hours after an attack could be casualties. Mustard gas produced blisters on the skin, severe eye inflammation that could cause temporary or permanent blindness, and damage to the mucous membranes of the respiratory tract. It was rarely immediately fatal. Its primary function was to create casualties that required care, thus removing not just the injured man, but also the men needed to care for him from the fighting force. It was one of the most effective disabling weapons of the war. The gas tonight, the alarm that woke you at 2:30, is chlorine, or a chlorine-phosgene mixture, released from cylinders in the German front line and drifting on the night wind toward your trench. The concentration reaching your position is not maximal. The wind is not exactly favorable, and the distance from the release point means that the cloud has dispersed somewhat, but it is real, and it is present, and the mask is doing its job. Men who had gas masks on and working were protected. Men who didn't, men whose masks were damaged, men who hadn't gotten them on in time, men in positions where the alarm hadn't reached, were not. The gas casualties of the Western Front were not primarily men who lacked protection. They were men whose protection had failed in specific ways. The mask seal that wasn't adequate, the filter that was exhausted from previous use and not replaced, The man who was asleep in a dugout when the alarm sounded and woke to the smell of the gas already in the air. The smell of chlorine is distinctive. Bleach, swimming pool, the specific sharp chemical scent that even at low concentrations is immediately identifiable as wrong. The smell of phosgene was sometimes described as freshly cut hay, which has an innocuous quality that made it particularly dangerous. The smell of mustard was sometimes not immediately detectable at all. The gas alarm in your trench has everyone masked and functional. The cloud passes over, slowly, in the way that atmospheric events move at their own pace, regardless of human urgency. And the gas NCO monitors the situation and eventually, after the appropriate checks, gives the all clear. You remove the mask. Your face is wet from the heat and exertion of wearing it. The cold air on your unmasked face is, in the specific context of having been wearing a sealed rubber mask for 40 minutes, one of the better sensations of the day. The gas attack produced no casualties in your section. This is good. In other sections of the line, where the cloud reached higher concentrations, the outcome was different. The gas does not distinguish between sections. It is now approximately 3:30 in the morning. You have been awake since 4:47 yesterday morning, with the brief, inadequate sleep of the early night. You are tired in a way that has moved past the normal experience of tiredness into the specific strange state of extended sleep deprivation. The slight unreality, the way the edges of things don't quite resolve properly, the body's insistence that something is wrong being processed by a brain that is too tired to respond adequately to the insistence. The rest of the night passes. Stand to approaches with the specific inevitability of something that has been approaching since the previous stand to ended. Chapter 9. The mind, shell shock, psychological survival, and what the trench did to people inside. It is nearly dawn again. The second stand to is approaching, and you have been in the trench for almost exactly 24 hours. In that time, you have experienced the morning stand to, a 40-minute artillery bombardment, the evacuation of wounded, a day of maintenance work punctuated by brief relief, a night of sentry duty, a gas alarm, the sounds of a raid on the adjacent sector, and the various smaller encounters with the trench environment, the mud, the rats, the cold, the insufficient food, the interrupted sleep, that together constitute the fabric of trench existence. You are, by any reasonable measure, not in great shape, not physically destroyed. Nothing has happened to you today that is individually catastrophic, but the accumulation matters, and the accumulation of 24 hours of this environment has done things to your body and your mind that you can feel even if you can't fully articulate them. The tiredness is the most immediately obvious. The muscle soreness from the day's physical work, the feet that have been wet for 24 hours and are registering the fact with a persistent low-level discomfort that has been present since mid-morning and shows no signs of resolving. The itch of the lice, which has become more assertive as the night has progressed. And underneath all of that, the psychological freight of the day, the artillery bombardment, the sound of incoming shells, which is a sound that the human nervous system was not designed to hear and manage without cost. The specific experience of lying in a dugout while the ground shook around you, unable to act, waiting for the random lottery of impact to resolve one way or another. The gas alarm at 2:30 in the morning, the moment of fumbling urgency in the dark. The prisoner passing through the trench with his frightened 19-year-old face. You're carrying all of this, and you've been here for one day. The men around you have been carrying versions of this for months. Let's talk about what that carrying did to people, because this is the dimension of the First World War that the popular mythology most consistently fails to address honestly. The psychological dimension, the damage done to the minds of the men who survived the trenches, and the specific way in which the medical and institutional response to that damage revealed some of the worst aspects of the society that had sent the men to the trenches in the first place. Shell shock, the term that was used in 1916, a lay term that eventually became the clinical label for a range of psychological conditions produced by the experience of combat, was a real phenomenon that affected a significant proportion of the men who served on the Western Front. The British Army alone recorded more than 80,000 cases of shell shock during the war, and this number represents only the cases that were formally diagnosed, the men who became visibly, clinically dysfunctional. The number of men who carried significant psychological damage without reaching the clinical threshold of diagnosis was certainly much larger. The symptoms of shell shock were varied and sometimes extreme: uncontrollable tremor, paralysis of limbs without physical injury, mutism, blindness without physical damage to the eyes, nightmares and intrusive memories that disrupted sleep and waking life, extreme startle responses to sounds, the inability to return to the front without panic symptoms that were physiologically real rather than chosen. These were not performances of illness. They were the mind and body's responses to experiences that exceeded the capacity of the human psychological system to process and file. The initial military and medical response to shell shock was, in many cases, inadequate and sometimes cruel. The early assumption, particularly prevalent among the senior officers whose own experience of combat was distant from the frontline trenches, was that shell shock represented weakness of will, lack of moral fiber, the failure of men who were not made of the same stuff as those who endured the same conditions without visible breakdown. The solution proposed from this assumption was discipline, the return of the affected man to duty by moral force, the treatment of psychological symptoms as behavioral failures that could be corrected by sufficiently firm authority. Men were executed for cowardice during the First World War. British soldiers shot at dawn after courts-martial that had insufficient time, insufficient expertise, and in many documented cases, insufficient evidence to distinguish between deliberate cowardice and the psychological collapse produced by the accumulation of combat experience. The debate over the pardoning of these men, which concluded with a blanket pardon in 2006, nearly 90 years after the armistice, was, at its core, a debate about exactly this question. Were these men failing to choose to do their duty, or were they incapable of choosing because the experience of the trenches had damaged the mechanisms of choice? The medical response gradually evolved. Doctors, particularly W.H.R. Rivers, at Craig Lockhart War Hospital in Edinburgh, whose work with the poets Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon provided some of the most documented cases in the war's psychological history, developed approaches that recognized shell shock as a genuine medical condition and treated it with what would now be recognized as early forms of psychotherapy, talking about the traumatic experiences, processing the memories, addressing the physiological symptoms as symptoms of psychological injury rather than willful failure. The treatment was incomplete and the understanding was partial. The concept of post-traumatic stress disorder, with its neurological and psychological framework, was not available, but the recognition that the human mind had genuine limits, that those limits could be reached by the specific experiences of the Western Front, and that men who reached those limits deserved medical treatment rather than courts. Marshall was a significant step toward the understanding of combat trauma that subsequent wars and subsequent decades of clinical experience have built on. The men in the trench around you are not clinically broken, not yet, or not visibly, but the signs of the weight they are carrying are visible to anyone who looks carefully. The flat expression that the corporal from Lancashire uses to manage the gap between what he's thinking and what he shows, the private from Birmingham's ability to absent himself, to go somewhere interior during the bombardment that is not the dugout but is equally protective. The specific quality of the humor that circulates through the section, dark, deflationary, self-deprecating in the particular way of people who have agreed to make the worst things into jokes, because the alternative to making them into jokes is to be undone by them. These are not pathological responses. They are the functional adaptations of people managing an extraordinary situation with the psychological tools available to them, and they were effective enough that the men who developed them were able to continue functioning in conditions that would have overwhelmed unadapted people entirely. They came at a cost. The cost was paid after the war. In the nightmares that persisted for years, in the difficulty of returning to civilian life after the specific intensity of the trench environment, in the relationships that couldn't absorb the distance created by experiences that were impossible to fully communicate to people who hadn't shared them. The men who came back from the Western Front carried what they had been through in ways that their families and communities often couldn't see or name, because the language and the conceptual framework for what they were carrying didn't adequately exist yet. The Lost Generation is the name given to the men who died in the First World War, and there were many of them, more than 700,000 British dead alone, nearly 10 million military dead across all combatants. But the men who survived were also, in a specific and important sense, lost, changed by what they had experienced in ways that were permanent, carrying a weight that they had been told to put down when they came home, and that they couldn't put down because it had become part of them. Let's be honest about something. While we're here, in the pre-dawn trench, with the second stand to approaching, you would not have survived this war. Not in the sense of dying in the trenches today. You have technically survived your day, but in the sense of the 24 hours you have experienced representing a sample, a single day from a rotation that would have lasted months and years, and the accumulation of that sample across the full duration would have done what it did to everyone who experienced it, changed you in ways that were not reversible, in ways that the world you came from was not prepared to understand or accommodate. The men beside you are going to do this for months more. Some of them are going to do it for years. Some of them are not going to come home. Some of them are going to come home and be fine outwardly and carry the inward cost quietly and never fully name it. Some of them are going to come home and not be fine, and the world they come home to is going to have insufficient patience for the specific shape of their not being fine. All of them, from the corporal from Lancashire to the private from Birmingham to the man whose name you still haven't learned, are doing something extraordinary with their ordinary human capabilities. The extraordinary thing is not the heroism of the battle, though battles happen, and what men do in them is genuinely worth the word. The extraordinary thing is the day. This day. The mud and the rats, and the bombardment, and the gas alarm, and the insufficient sleep, and the lukewarm stew, and the fruitcake, and the card game, and the rum at stand down, and the whole complex, human, specific, unrepeatable texture of a day in a place that should not have been able to contain human life, but somehow, through the stubborn adaptability of people, did. The sky is beginning to lighten in the east. Stand 2, Chapter 10, the larger picture, what the trenches meant, and what they cost. The stand 2 is over. The morning proves once again that no attack is materializing. The rum ration is distributed. You have been in the trench for 24 hours. Let's step back from the immediate and look at what you've been inside. The larger structure, the strategic reality, the historical context that the daily experience of the trench was embedded in, and that shaped everything about how the war was fought and how long it lasted. The Western Front was the product of a specific military failure in the opening weeks of the war. The German Schlieffen Plan, the operational plan that had organized German war planning for years, called for a rapid sweep through Belgium and northern France that would defeat the French armies in the west within 6 weeks, after which Germany could turn to deal with Russia in the east. The plan nearly worked. In August 1914, the German armies swept through Belgium and into France at a pace that threatened to do exactly what the plan envisioned. And then it stopped. At the First Battle of the Marne, in September 1914, the French and British halted the German advance. The Germans dug in. The Allies dug in. Both sides tried to outflank the other to the north in the series of engagements called the Race to the Sea, which ended with both lines reaching the English Channel in October 1914. The Western Front, the line of approximately 700 kilometers from the North Sea to Switzerland, was essentially fixed by November 1914, and it would remain essentially fixed, with variations of a few kilometers here and there, for nearly 4 years. The fixity of the front was not an accident or a failure of planning in isolation. It was the product of a specific military technological reality. In 1914 to 1918, the defensive was dramatically stronger than the offensive. The combination of the machine gun, massed artillery, barbed wire, and the trench itself created a defensive system that attacking infantry could not penetrate at the operational level, regardless of tactical success at the local level. The machine gun was the decisive weapon of the Western Front's static phase. A single Maxim or Vickers machine gun, properly positioned with adequate ammunition and crew, could fire 400 to 500 rounds per minute and could cover a specific field of fire with essentially absolute lethality against infantry in the open. A belt of machine guns covering the approaches to a trench line made an infantry assault across open ground, across no man's land, an extraordinarily costly proposition. The artillery was the other decisive factor. The massed artillery of the First World War, the thousands of guns from light field artillery to the massive heavy guns that fired shells the size of a small car, could destroy any above-ground structure and could kill anyone in the open. The defense responded by going underground, by building the dugouts and the deep positions that could survive artillery. The attack responded by using ever larger quantities of artillery in the hope of destroying the defenses before the infantry went forward. The Somme, which began on July 1st, 1916, during the period we've placed you in the trench, is the most extreme example of this pattern on the British side. The week-long preliminary bombardment before the infantry assault was the largest artillery preparation in British military history to that point. Over 1,500 guns firing more than 1.5 million shells over 7 days. The theory was that the German defenses would be destroyed, the wire would be cut, and the infantry would be able to advance across no man's land in relative safety. The theory was wrong. The German dugouts in the Somme sector were deep, 30, 40, even 50 feet below the surface, deep enough to survive the bombardment. The wire was cut in places, but not everywhere. When the bombardment stopped and the British infantry went forward at 7:30 in the morning of July 1st, the German defenders emerged from their dugouts, manned their machine guns, and the result was the worst single day in British military history. Approximately 57,000 British casualties, killed, wounded, and missing in a single day. 57,000 casualties in one day. On one army of one combatant, on one front of a war that involved dozens of countries and millions of soldiers. The scale of the First World War's killing is one of those facts that resists being fully grasped. The total military debt of the war, approximately 10 million men, was a number that exceeded anything in previous human experience of war. The British Empire lost approximately 900,000 dead. France lost approximately 1.4 million. Germany lost approximately 2 million. Russia lost approximately 1.7 million. The Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary, Italy, all the other combatants, the arithmetic of dead keeps going. The men in the trench were not thinking about these numbers. The men in the trench were thinking about their rum ration and the parapet that needed repair, and whether the mail would come today. This is not because they were incapable of the larger view. It is because the larger view was not survivable on a daily basis. The human mind can function in environments of danger by narrowing its focus to the immediate and manageable, and the men of the Western Front had narrowed their focus as a survival mechanism that was, within the context of the trench, rational and effective. The men who had the larger view, the generals, the politicians, the strategists who were managing the war at the operational and strategic level, were, in many cases, making decisions whose costs they were not paying directly and whose effects they were processing at a remove that made human-scale consequences easier to deal with than they would have been at ground level. This is not simply a condemnation of the generals. The strategic reality they were managing, the deadlock of the Western Front, the impossibility of decisive breakthrough given the military technological balance, the political constraints that required continuing to fight while the situation for change was developed, was genuinely difficult and genuinely without obvious solution. Men like Haig and Joffre and Falkenhayn were not stupid or indifferent. They were managing an unprecedented situation with the military theory and the practical experience available to them, and the available tools were inadequate to the problem in ways that cost enormous numbers of lives. But the costs were paid in the trenches, not in the command posts. The men on the Somme on July 1st, 1916, paid the cost of a strategic approach that had failed to account for the resilience of the German deep dugouts. The men at Passchendaele in 1917 paid the cost of an offensive continued past the point where weather and ground conditions had made it viable. The men in the trenches throughout the war paid the cost of living inside a military deadlock that their commanders were trying to break, and that proved, for most, of the war's duration, unbreakable by the methods available. The war did end, not through the decisive breakthrough that both sides had been pursuing since 1914, though the German spring offensives of 1918 and the Allied 100 Days Offensive that followed came closer to that kind of operational movement than anything since 1914. The war ended through the exhaustion of Germany's capacity to continue. The naval blockade that had steadily degraded the German economy and the German population's food supply, the arrival of American troops in France in significant numbers, the collapse of Germany's allies, and the internal political crisis that produced the armistice of November 11, 1918. When the armistice came, the men in the trenches, the British men, the French men, the German men, who had been in the trench on the other side of no man's land for the same weeks and months of the same experience, mostly did not celebrate in the way that the popular image suggests. Some did, but many accounts describe a specific strange silence when the guns stopped. The absence of the artillery background that had been continuous for so long that its absence was stranger than its presence. The specific surreal quality of a landscape that was suddenly not being shot at. The men walked out of the trenches. They went home. Eventually, after the various processes of demobilization that took months, they put on civilian clothes and tried to be the people they had been before, and found, with varying degrees of success, that the people they had been before and the people they were now were not entirely the same people, and that the distance between those two versions of themselves was sometimes bridgeable and sometimes not. The ones who couldn't bridge it didn't necessarily look like they couldn't bridge it. They went to work, they married, they had children, they participated in the life of the communities they returned to. They also had nightmares, and flinched at loud noises, and found that certain smells or sounds or particular qualities of light brought the trench back with a vividness that the years had not adequately softened. They carried the trench with them in the way that profound experiences are carried. Not as a memory exactly, but as a permanent feature of how they engaged with the world. This is what the trench cost beyond the dead. It cost the men who survived it a part of themselves, the part that the experience had changed permanently in ways that neither they nor the society that received them back had the framework to fully understand or accommodate. Conclusion: the second stand-to is over. The rum ration has been drunk. The morning is gray and cold, and the mud is exactly as wet as it was yesterday morning, because the mud is not interested in yesterday or today, or the distinction between them. Your 24 hours is up. You are leaving the trench. Not through the front, not over the top, across no man's land, in the direction of the German wire, through the communication trench, the way supplies and reinforcements and casualties and all the other traffic of the front moved, backward, toward the support line, toward the reserve line, toward the rear areas where the field kitchens were, and the aid posts, and the billets where men rotated off the line could sleep in something approaching a bed for a few days before rotating back. You pass through the communication trench. The mud is deeper here than in the front line in places, less maintained, narrower, occupied, less continuously, and therefore repaired less regularly. You move through it with the specific high-stepping gait that the mud requires, lifting each foot fully before placing it, because the mud's grip on a boot that is placed without this deliberation is real and memorable. The men you pass, going in the opposite direction, heading toward the front line to begin their own rotation, look at you with the specific assessment of people who have been in the trench and can recognize someone coming out of it. You look like someone coming out of it. Mud from the knee down on everything, the particular expression of someone who has been somewhere specific and is processing the transition back from it. Eyes that are tired in a way that sleep alone won't fix. One of them nods at you. You nod back. No words. The nod contains enough. You emerge from the communication trench into the slightly more open ground of the support area, and the immediate physical sensation of being in a space that is not bounded by trench walls on both sides is one of those things that you couldn't have predicted would feel significant, and that feels very significant indeed. The sky is visible in all directions. The horizon is a horizon, not a sandbag parapet. You sit down on an ammunition box outside a support line dugout and take stock of yourself. 24 hours. You experienced Stand 2 twice. 40-minute artillery bombardment. The evacuation of 2 wounded men. A day of maintenance work that required sustained physical effort in difficult conditions. Night sentry duty, a gas alarm. The sounds and aftermath of a trench raid on an adjacent sector. Inadequate food, inadequate sleep, wet feet, lice, rats, the smell, the cold, the mud, and the specific sustained psychological experience of being in an environment where random lethal violence was not a possibility, but a structural feature of the landscape, where the next shell could arrive at any moment, where the pattern of the day was organized around the management of this fact. You did not thrive. Let's be honest about that. You were not effective as a soldier in the specific ways that matter. The physical conditioning that would have made the maintenance work less consuming and the sentry duty less exhausting. The experience that would have made the periscope observation meaningful rather than a process of watching. Darkness and being uncertain about what you were seeing. The psychological preparation that would have made the bombardment manageable rather than consuming. The small unit cohesion, the membership in the specific community of your section, built over months of shared experience that the men around you had, and that provided the foundation for everything else. You were an observer ultimately, an outsider who was present for 24 hours in a world built for people who had been shaped by months and years of preparation and experience. The men who were there were not extraordinary in themselves. They were ordinary people who had been made capable of the extraordinary thing they were doing by the time and the process that had formed them for it. And the extraordinary thing they were doing was this: surviving, not just physically, though the physical survival was itself a considerable achievement, but surviving in the broader sense. Maintaining their humanity in conditions designed to eliminate it. Finding the fruitcake and the card game, and the dry humor and the genuine affection between the men of the section in the space, alongside the mud and the gas, and the rats and the shells, keeping something human alive in an environment that was systematically trying to kill everything. They succeeded, imperfectly and at enormous cost, and the imperfection and the cost are as much a part of the story as the success. The 700,000 British dead, the millions of dead across all armies, the men who came home and couldn't bridge the distance between who they'd been and who they were. These are not footnotes to a story about survival and resilience. They are the center of the story. The survival happened within a context of colossal, systematic, unprecedented loss, and the humanity that the men maintained existed alongside a destruction of human life that was the defining fact of the period. The corporal from Lancashire, the private from Birmingham, the man whose name you never learned. They are still in the trench as you walk away from it, beginning another day that is the same as yesterday in its structure and different in its specific content. A different bombardment, different duties, different letters from home, or absence of letters, different moments of dark humor and genuine warmth, and the specific quality of fear that the trench specialized in producing and the men specialized in managing. They are there. You are not. You are going home, to a world with adequate food and dry clothes, and sleep that is not interrupted by stand-to, and a future that is not organized around the daily management of the specific conditions of the Western Front. Take a moment before you go to understand what that means. What it means that you can leave, and they cannot. What it means that the world you're returning to, with its abundant comforts and its various manageable difficulties, and its organizing assumption that life is supposed to be survivable, exists in the specific relationship it does to the world you've just come from. The trench produced the world we live in. Not only history is not that simple, but as one of the central, defining, shaping experiences of the 20th century. The men who came out of it, and the men who didn't, and the societies that sent them in and received them back, were changed by it in ways that echoed forward across the century. The political arrangements that emerged from the war and its aftermath. The medical understanding of psychological trauma that developed from the attempt to understand what the war had done to the men who survived it. The literature, Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, Robert Graves, Eric Maria Remarque, that tried to tell the truth about the experience in the face of the public narrative of glorious sacrifice that the authorities preferred. The trench was real. What happened in it was real. The mud was real, and the rats were real, and the shells were real, and the fruitcake was real, and the card game was real, and the nod between two men passing in a communication trench who had both been somewhere specific and recognized each other as people who had been there was real. All of it together is the day you just survived. Remember it.